We all have at some point in time contemplated the implications the British had over the Indian subcontinent in its entirety, whether we accept the incorrigible changes it has caused among generations of natives, socio-economically and mentally. This inquisitiveness again brings us back to the very root cause and upbringings from which the Indian subcontinent was later subjugated by foreign forces. What really led this gradual change of socio-political spheres in the Indian subcontinent? And how can we historically trace it back as far as the 17th century? Well, today for this video, I will be discussing the main driving forces that led to merchant companies such as the East Indian Company to later assert administrative power and later subjugate local populations under their hegemony. How could such a company driven by the desire to trade and uphold basis for economics would later go on to intervene in local politics under the guise of further aiding their greedy interests? So let us begin. Before getting into the main pulp of its origination, the companies, we need to first understand what really the situation was like during the 15th and 16th centuries in the domain of colonialism. Portugal and Spain practically ruled the ballpark at the time, holding trade networks much before most of the major powers really got into it. Spain had its repertoire of colonies in the Americas, whilst the Treaty of Tordesillas divided the world into zones of control for the Portuguese and Spanish to feast upon. India at the time constituted well over 25% of the world economy at that time during Aurangzeb's rule of the Mughal Empire when everything was went into pernicious decline. The only power at that time that actually rivaled the Mughal Empire and the Indian economy at the time was none other than was another great civilization at its doorstep, the Chin Empire, ruled by the Manchus, that lasted all the way till the 20th century. Trade with the Indians was vital for any European seeking for a profit, because again, India was burgeoning with all these rich resources, and of course, any company or any empire that happens to find any proper trade route with them will, of course, gain a profit. The spice trade at the time was especially lucrative. The the black pepper being considered equivalent to gold due to its notoriety in Europe. The desire to find new trading routes as well as to set up a form of control over the trade routes found many ambitious merchants and travelers find new and creative ways to extract as much goods as they can from natives in the land. This stands true um, to about every company that goes under the sobriquet of East India. Britain, in the great game of things, was late to the party. It was at the time under a much more precarious state to establish trading companies unlike its European counterparts like the Portuguese and the Spaniards. There could be many reasons as to why the English were late in the game of colonization. One could be that whilst the Ottomans took over Byzantium in 1453, the Hundred Years' War, the wars between the French and the English, that lasted for over 100 years, even though that's an abnormally oversimplified version of it, was close to cessation. Another valid reason can be for the fact that the Tudor family, which ruled England at the time, which seized power later on, were too fixated on local politics rather than indulging in, the world politics, if I might add. Wales' other great powers were colonizing and finding new trade routes. Henry IX preferred to plunder Spanish ships en route under the guise of privateers and piracy. This was, however, to change. There would be a drastic change in the coming decades as they would shift from privateers like Sir Francis Drake, and then they would go more into the main game of colonization. I decided to, by the way, several things in the making of this video, like how other companies shared influence over the Indian subcontinent, as well as neglecting many other endeavors other companies took part in at that time. We will instead primarily be focusing on the East Indian Company and its inception for this video only. So we won't really talk about the French East Indian Company nor the BOC, because Trust me, those things deserve another video of their own, and I decided to only fixate this entire video on the East Indian Company and its inception alone. Following the great exploits of Sir Francis Drake and his clandestine relationship with the then Queen of England, Queen Elizabeth I, Virginia colony, coupled with the destruction of the Spanish Armada in 1588, created a new sense of pride and ardent ambition and encouraged traders to find new routes to trade with. So the destruction of the Spanish Armada in 1588 the English Navy made the English Navy the new great power in the ocean, and this again will give them more ambition and more incentives for them to further open in trade routes and to trade with, to find other places and locations to trade with. So this new influx made a group of merchants under the aegis of the British Crown, numbering in around 218 people, to form the East Indian Company. The decree that was passed in the year 1600 is known as the Charter Act of 1600, which promoted the company and encouraged its merchants to trade with the outside world. So the inception of the East Indian Company starts in the year 1600, when a group of merchants subscribing to the idea of trading with the outside world decided to group together and create this new company under the aegis of the British Crown, and this would later on augment to the amending of the Charter Act of 1600. The main driving force behind the imposing of this Charter Act was due to the influx of revenue from the Englishmen subscribing to the idea of creating a company, as they were really falling behind their rivals like the Dutch. The money went from around £30,000 at first to skyrocketing to over £72,000. The English tradesmen demanded the further acceleration of opening trade with the East, and the Queen of England complied by imposing the Charter of 1600, as I previously aforementioned. The company started off as a joint stock venture, much like the VOC in the Dutch. The very first proto-stock system, where average citizens could buy stocks of, if by God's grace, and if by God's grace the trade would turn out to be as propitious as expected, would make a huge profit from it. The Charter Act of 1600, much like many of the acts that will be imposed later, will be revised after a few decades' time. The main formula of the Charter Act of 1600 went as follows. Piracy and unauthorized trades / interlopers will be condemned and will have to forfeit their gains obtained from trade. Also will have to face punitive punishments as well. The Charter Act would remain in force for 15 years or so. The Charter Act would be facing an annulment if things were not to go as successful for the company. Like, for example, if they went bankrupt and lacked the profits made from trading across the globe. So these were the main provisions that were made in the Charter Act of 1600, which was passed, which led to the creation of the East Indian Company, which was actually founded by a bunch of merchants numbering in around 218. So this company originally started off as a joint stock venture company, much like the VOC. So this basically would mean that certain shareholders, certain people that own money, and certain people that own shares in the company would have control of the company, would have more influence in the company, as I previously said. So now that we've gotten that clear, now that we've gotten what exactly made the company bring about and how exactly was the company founded, let's look at some of the breakaways from the company. Like, after all, you've got to have an enemy if you're going to make a company. In the year 1653, the then King of England, Charles I, granted Sir William Cotton the right to trade independently from the East Indian Company. This formation of a breakaway company would later be known as the Asada Company. The company would primarily trade in places such as Madagascar, and it was an overall failure when it comes to the scope of things then. In fact, the only thing that rescued the company was none other than Oliver Cromwell, the Puritan man who famously decapitated one of the English kings, um, whom, after receiving reparations from the Dutch after the infamous Amboina massacre, which again is an entirely different story of its own. You know, the English and the Dutch had rivalries with each other, and the Amboina massacre saw the death of a lot of English men and Japanese, what do you say, a Japanese person as well, which again stifled relations between the Dutch and the English. So the only thing that is actually making the company alive, the only resuscitating factor for the company to ever live was actually through Oliver Cromwell's finances. And eventually the company saw itself in union with the London company later on. So the Asada company can be an example of a breakaway company that has formed, um, that formed itself, that broke away from the EIC to establish itself as an independent force, but later go ahead and merge with the London company. So now that we got that clear, I would like to go on to talk about the merging of the old and new company. So what exactly is the old and new company? Well, before before I talk about the EIC, I wanted to discuss about the dichotomy between the old and new company. So, following the revolution of 1688, rivaling companies merged to form something popularly known as the new company. The new company, in a sense, opposed the old company, or otherwise known as the London company. In the year 1693, the old company successfully managed to secure a charter act that concerned itself with granting privileges and concessions when it comes to trade. Later, the charter acts of 1693 and 1694 and 1698 would follow the same provisions as well. In the year 1698, Montagu, the then Chancellor of Exchequer, to somehow reimburse any form of chagrin formed financially, decided to set up a new company known as the English Company Trading to the East. I know it's a mouthful and it's a terrible name. But once again, the old company already had a hegemony over the English company's share. Added to that, they pretty much had a stronghold over some of the port cities set up around that time. So an amalgamation between the old and new companies was at some point necessary to keep some sense of sanity, and thus, by the intervention of Lord Godolphin and the Act of 1707, so the coalescing of the companies under the sobriquet of the United Company of Merchants Trading to the East Indies. Man, that is a huge mouthful. To be fair with you, even terrible if I might add. This name given to the company, the East Indian Company, would stick till the year 1833, which was a catastrophic year for the EIC economically and politically speaking. So yes, we are using the term the East Indian Company. We mean what we mean by that is that we are technically using the name it was called after the Charter Act of 1833. Before that, it was called, as I said, the United Company of Merchants Trading to the East Indies. So it's like it's kind of weird, naming it the EIC, even though it's pretty simplified. And in fact, for the majority of its epoch, it was actually called the United Company of Merchants Trading to the East Indies. So now that we got the some parts of the EIC clear, now that we got a better understanding of how exactly EIC was formed, let's look at how the internal politics of EIC was, the system of governance. How exactly was the EIC governed when it comes to, and how exactly was it run by various people, various high-ranking officials, of course. Now that we have discussed about the early parts of the East Indian Company, following its start by the Charter Act of 1600, we have also gone through portions of strife and contention between the EIC and other rivaling companies of an equal standing. Now let us talk about the framework of the company's functioning. As I said previously, how exactly did the company function, and what were its intricacies when that in some way or the other made it different from the EOC, the BOC, and other counterparts as well. Under the Charter Act, the main governance of the company would be administered by 24 committees, each committee consisting of a single member. The committee were, in fact, predecessors of the soon to be Court of Directors, which would later also be numbered to be around 24 people. The primary change seen in the committee to the court of directors was seen in the year 1709 when the amalgamation of the old and new company was done. As previously aforementioned, this change in the system of governance of the company saw a shift in the years of tenure for the chairman and the deputy chairman. Now that we've got that clear, let us get to the part of how these people, quote directors, were exactly elected. Now remember, universal suffrage and concepts like that did not exist back then. So you couldn't see the average baron vote, for example. So there certainly had to be this sense of prerequisite. There had to be a certain list of prerequisites for you to actually play a part in the internal politics of the EIC, which so among them, for starters, you were needed as a prerequisite to have at least £500 worth of shares in the company, which means you own £500 worth of shares in the company. Another thing to add is that anyone that has £500 or above has the right to vote. So it did not matter whether you had 800 or 600, you still had one vote, which is again quite an equalizing matter back then. You would still have a single vote over the matters. To run for the position of court of directors, you would require to be in a much more prerogative stance than others. The court of directors, after all, was vested to only a handful of affluent merchants. So the requirement to run as a member in the court of directors was over £2,000 worth of shares, a hefty sum at the time, and adjusted to inflation would be worth tens of thousands by today's standards. What what is fascinating about all of this is that the Charter Act, which later on in the series we will see in the multitude of, was renewed on a two-decade basis. The Charter Act of 1833, for example, succeeded the Charter Act of 1813. Meanwhile, the Charter Act of 1813 succeeded the Charter Act of 1793. The fact that the company managed to hold a system of voting where a group of like-minded people took the plight to bring in financial and political change is a great factor as to why this company is special in its own rights. Territorial expansionism. As you might have already guessed, the company, much like many other East Indian companies, was expansionist in nature. Their intentions were not, however, to govern huge swaths of lands in the name of attrition and nebulous God given right, but rather to establish trade routes, forts alongside the coast, and that catered towards their own interests. The main authority of the British or the Indian lied not only in a few charter acts and grants given by the English crown or the Parliament, but rather an agreement between local rulers and sometimes even the Mughals themselves, as we will later see that these grants were provided over a long period of time, which gave them some control over trade and later on made them able to exercise political power over the land. The first trading ship to have arrived was in the year 1608, led by Sir William Hawkins. As you may or may not know, the ship was named Hector. It was famously named as Hector, as they were not per se as, but they were not as per se as successful in gaining foothold in the country. This was due to opposition from the Portuguese. The Portuguese at the time had a huge stronghold over the country. The Estado da India, for example, you had viceroys such as Albuquerque or Almeida, and all of them. They were the Portuguese had a strong foothold in places such as Hooghly, Goa, Cochin, and so on. So, but in the year following, in the year 1612, however, we see the British trading from the port of Machilipatnam, and later in the early year 16. I'm sorry, but the first trading ship to have arrived was in the year 1608, led by Sir William Hawkins. The ship was named Hector, and they were not per se as successful in gaining a foothold in the country. As I previously said, this was due to opposition from the Portuguese. In the year 1612, however, we see that the British trading from the port of Machilipatnam and the famous English diplomat Sir Thomas Roe arrives at Jahangir's court as an ambassador to the British crown, which was then coronated to King James I. With Sir Thomas Roe, a famous English diplomat at Jahangir's court, we have someone prominent, someone famous, someone well known, a well known diplomat in the English sphere, arrive at the courts of Jahangir. Um, and things eased between the countries. Whilst on the other side, things fired up between the Portuguese and Jahangir. Later on, a royal farman, which basically is a royal decree, would be passed on, which led to the establishment of the first English uh, factory in Surat. This added on to the ease relationships the two powers had, and they would later go on to establish multiple more factories in Ahmedabad, Agra, and Bhuj. So went on the Great British Project. Forts sentinels were made during the early years of the company. Although site of what was to become in the future was certainly nebulous in many regards, the main goal for the merchants and diplomats at the time was to secure trade interests and to smooth commerce between the natives and the traders themselves. A whole entourage of materials and substances were being traded between the company merchants and autochthonous members of the land. In the year 1640, the British were successfully able to secure a wide strip of land that was once an old settlement of the Portuguese known as Saint Tom in Madras, the then main Vijayanagar Empire, which was at the time close to cessation and extinct at that point of time, followed a system of governance known as the Naik system, which where territories of land would be divided amongst chiefdoms and rulers. One such prominent Hindu chief provided the British the first taste of what administration over a piece of land was genuinely like. Madras, in all its regards, could be considered EIC's first propriety holding. Do not worry, of course, we have not forgotten Bengal, the main epicenter of trade and commerce at the time, although I won't be able to discuss its vast richness and the land possessed, which has made it the hub for trade of cotton and clothes all over the known world. The foothold of the British over the Bay of Bengal is quite an intriguing story as it narrates how over a gradual period, the British were, through Chisenary means, able to gain its grants and allowances, which gradually made it able for them to later gain full Diwani rights over the said territory. In the year 1634, an imperial farman granted the English to trade in the Bay of Bengal. The English would later go on to settle in modern-day cities of Dhaka, Rajmahal, and Malda, albeit they were never exactly had any territorial gains or any administrative power. In the year 1651, the then Subedar of Bengal, one of Shah Jahan's son, Shah Shuja, granted the British a nishan for which a page of 3,000 rupees had to be paid annually. So to simplify it, you these the Britishers, the company merchants had to pay an annual fees of around 3,000 rupees in order to pay off for the fact that they were trading in the Bay of Bengal. So the British officers, the officials, were however not all that satisfied with this foreman being imposed on them. The officials felt a sense of malaise due to the rigmarole it took to maintain trade as well as bear through the unwanted checks and tolls and all that. Hostilities were later sprout between the English and Mughals as the British demanded the Mughals to provide them the right to build forts and settlements that granted them the right to trade easily and smoothen the level of commerce. This strife would later sprout and reach its apogee in the year 1686, which led to the first Anglo-Mughal War, where the Mughals managed to invade and ransack British forts, whilst the British did exactly the same. When Hooghly was eventually taken by the Mughal authorities, an English diplomat was sent in order to negotiate with the Mughals, which made both the officials to agree with the previous sum of 3,000 rupees. Job Charnock, the company official sent there, officially arrived at the marshy village of Sutanuti in August 1690. This led to a factory being built there. As Zamindar in the Pradhaman district, named Shobha Singh, rebelled and subsequently granted the English control over three villages, which would later go on go into some sort of lease of around 1200 rupees annually. It was there we see the legendary settlement of Fort William being constructed, which, by the way, is historically really important, as this would lead to some mind-blowing changes in the coming future. Fort William was officially named after the then King William III and would later serve as a seat of the presidency. At around that time, we see that the formation of only two presidencies, the Bengal presidency, which was still at its nascency, the Madras presidency, which was, as aforementioned, was the English's first taste of administrative power to a certain extent. In the year 1661, a famous marriage treaty was signed between the Portuguese and English, which by the way granted the English full control over the land Bombay. Bombay at the time was part of the Portuguese. Bombay, and granting them control over Bombay actually gave them control over a completely new swath of land besides the one seen on the Coromandel coast and Bengal. Now that the question of governance and how the British managed to control these swaths of land that was sporadically dispersed all throughout the Indian subcontinent. Now that we got that clear, I have I have in my previous statements mentioned several things about how governance took place in the uh, higher echelons of company society. I would like to add that the code of directors, which included 24 members, controlled all the decisions made by the company abroad. There was, however, a certain level of autonomy the company officials who could enjoy overseas. Each presidency by around the early 18th century, including Bombay, Madras, and the Bengal presidency, would rule and be governed under a council and a chief member, and what oversaw them was the president. So you had a council, you had a chief member, and you had the president. As we will later notice, the Bengal would become the powerhouse, whilst other subordinate presidencies would falter by in power play against it. But that's decades ahead of time. But around that time, all the presidencies were being treated in relative equality, with the company's main headquarters even being held in Surat and Mumbai, Bombay at the time. It was only around the it was only under the Regulating Act of 1773 we see the true prominence of the Bengal presidency, which towered over the rest of the presidency in the subcontinent. We are almost at the end of this video essay. I have discussed several topics here. First, the early footholds the English company had over the subcontinent, as well as later on forming into factories and then being granted several rights by local rulers, whether it be in the Vijayanagar Empire or the Subadar or under the aegis of the Mughal Empire. We have seen that later on the English forces would later gain a much more strong foothold over Bengal, which will later perpetuate into the entire subcontinent. But that is too far and too subtle for me to explain right now. Next video, I'll be talking about the famous Farman by Furushia, also known as Furushia Farman of 1715. Also known as the Magna Carta of the EIC. I'll also be discussing the Battle of Plassey, the Battle of Buxar, and the Regulating Act of 1773, and much more. So I hope you enjoyed this video. I hope this was informative to you, as this was merely just a mere simplification of how exactly the politics and what exactly was going on in India at the time. Because, by the way, India was a melting pot of different empires and kingdoms at the time. By the time Aurangzeb died in 1707, which again saw the rise of several polities in the Indian subcontinent. So we went from explaining how the Indian internal politics of the EIC functioned to them being granted a royal farman in 1634 and in 1615, which granted them the right to internal trade and as well as internal commerce between the natives of the land. And then we will later go on to explain in a much more subtle and nuanced detail in further videos. I hope you found this video to be extremely informative, as I will discuss more or less about the topics that will follow this in much more greater detail. So thank you for watching this video, and I hope to see you next time. Goodbye.